Hello class, this is Wade Renando, and this is Chapter 4 on Globalization and Diversity, Geography of a Changing World, Latin America. We will not be covering the Caribbean, which is Chapter 5 due to a lack of time, but Chapter 4 includes South America, Latin America, and Mexico, so Portuguese and Spanish-speaking parts of South and Central America and Mexico. So Latin America is a large area. If you include Mexico, it is larger than the continental United States and Canada put together, if you include Mexico. And Brazil itself is about the same size as the continental United States. Mexico is about the size of Greenland, and there are numerous Central American countries here that are a little smaller. The area has a shared colonial history. It was settled by mostly the Spanish and the Portuguese in the early 1500s. And Latin America is roughly the size of North America, except it has a population of about 555 million. And North America, the United States and Canada, has roughly 353 million people. So it actually has a larger population than North America. It's an area that's mostly Catholic. Large numbers of people in the area are multiracial, mix of European, African, and American Indians, and it's also an area that is rapidly urbanizing. There are many large cities and rapidly growing cities, including Sao Paulo in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City. Mexico City is about the same size as the metropolitan New York City area, so it's a large area. The climate in South America and Latin America is very diverse. It has a combination of warm rainforests near the equator, such as the Amazon basin, wet season and dry season tropical savannas a little north and south of those areas. Also parts of Brazil are like that. Mid-latitude continental climate, similar to what we might have in the southeast part of the U.S., and then areas of deserts and steppes. So quite a bit of variety of climates. It also has the second highest mountain range in the world, the Andes, which is also the longest mountain range in the world. The Andes, if you were to stretch them out straight, would go from San Francisco roughly to London, England. So very long mountain range and the second highest mountain range in the world. So Latin America has a very diverse ecosystem with a wide variety of tropical forests. Tropical forests in South America are often called the neotropics to separate them from, say, African tropical areas. The neotropics are basically the tropical areas of the New World, South America. There's a growing environmental movement in the area. Like in the United States, that became more aware of environmental issues starting in, say, the 60s and 70s. South America is also becoming more aware of environmental issues, trying to crack down on pollution, push for renewable energies. And it is an important population centers. It has an area that has some very large major cities, as we discussed earlier, and a large percentage of the population that lives in big cities. Some of these cities have large urban slums around them called favelas. Rio de Janeiro is known for that. And it started rapidly urbanizing in the 1950s and 60s and the mid-20s. Some major landforms or major geographical areas in Latin America include the Andes, the very long mountain range we talked about, the uplands. This is the area of transition between the Andes and the low-lying Amazon basins. And the shields, these are large upland plateaus. A plateau is an area that's relatively high and flat, and parts of Brazil and other parts of Latin America have large areas that are considered plateaus. The picture on the bottom left is of the Bolivian Altiplano and Lake Titicaca. The Altiplano is an area of transition between the mountainous areas of the Andes and the deserts to the west. It has lots of unique geographic features. There's a video, a TED Talk that talks about the Altiplano. And then the picture on the right is Patagonia, and this is a large wilderness area in the bottom third of South America, sort of the pointy cone-shaped part of Chile and Argentina is where Patagonia is. It's a region roughly the size of France, looks a little like the American Rockies, and it has a lot of unique wildlife like llamas and alpacas. So the Andes, again, are the second highest mountain range in the world and the longest. They stretch from northwest Venezuela and go to the southern tip of South America. And the picture on the top right shows what the Andes look like from space. And then the bottom two pictures show some of the variation in the Andes. It can be tropical and lush near the equator, and as you get further south, it gets a little drier and looks a little like the American Rockies. And like in many places of the world, climate change is affecting some of the glaciers and ice in the Andes Mountain range. Glaciers are retreating due to higher temperatures, and this has caused some environmental problems, including threatening water supplies of different cities in Latin America. Mexico City gets a large amount of its water from mountain snow, and as the mountain snow continues to decline, they're having to pump water at great expense up from further down the mountains. It's in a relatively high area, and it's expensive to have to pump water up a mountain range. So Lima, Peru is also suffering from potential water shortages due to a lack of snowmelt that used to supply water to the area. So there is a lot of variation in what crops can be grown on certain mountains in Latin America and elsewhere. And this is sometimes called altitudinal zonation. That means different latitudes have different temperatures that support different kinds of plant life. So relatively low near sea level, you can grow sugarcane, tropical fruits, lowland tubers, maize, and so on. And as you get a little further up, you can grow coffee and maize and warm weather vegetables. Coffee needs to have altitudes above roughly 3,000 feet. And then as you get further up, it gets a little drier, a little cooler, and you can grow wheat and barley, maize. You can raise sheep and alpaca and so on. And then when you get above about 12,000 feet, it's difficult to grow anything, but you can still have pigs, llamas, and alpacas and other things. Then above about 15 to 18,000 feet is the snow line, and you cannot grow or raise many things above that. And the air actually cools at a relatively stable rate called the environmental lapse rate. The temperature declines about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit for every 1,000 feet. So there's this fairly steady cooling as you go up, 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit for every 1,000 feet you go up. So here are just a couple of pictures of some of the variations there are in the uplands of Mexico and Central America. Again, these are areas that are not coastal but not mountainous either, kind of in between. North and South Carolina and parts of Virginia have a large upland area. These are flat areas in Mexico and Central America that contains the massive megapolis of Mexico City. The picture on the bottom left is of Mexico City. And then this large upland area also has some rather rural areas and some older small colonial towns as well. Then there are the areas called the Eastern Shields. These are areas in South America that are large upland areas of exposed metamorphic rock. Sao Paulo is an area that's on the edge of the Eastern Shield that actually has very fertile soil surrounding it, which makes it suitable for farming. And the pictures you see are different parts of this Eastern Shield in South America. And then here's a picture of some of the environmental issues that are facing South America. The Amazon rainforest is very large, but it's vulnerable to deforestation, especially on its southern part. You can see here there's this arc of deforestation here, and this is the area of the greatest deforestation in the region. Some of the deforestation is people cutting down wood to sell. A lot of it is people burning wood to make room for cattle, which is more profitable than forests. And in addition to deforestation, there are problems with water shortages that we've talked about. There are also large slums, and some of the large slums have large amounts of trash and pollution on the outskirts of town that poor people sometimes live in out of desperation due to a lack of affordable housing. And some scientists now think that the mass burning of the Amazon basin is actually releasing more CO2 into the air than the forest naturally absorbs. Forests usually absorb CO2 and release oxygen, but because of so much deforestation, the Amazon basin, which should be absorbing carbon dioxide, is actually releasing it instead. There are areas that have been set aside as nature preserves, and Brazil has had some luck curbing deforestation, but it's only been partially successful. So here's some more information on the destructions of the rainforests. Rainforests only cover about 6% of the Earth's landmass, but they are home to about 50% of the species found in the world in this specific biome. The government of Brazil has actually given some financial incentives to clear some of the forests to make room for cattle and for ranching. It kind of considers it to be a development, but it's starting to cut back on some of these subsidies. So right now, actually in Brazil, there's a big political fight as to whether areas that are currently wilderness should continue to be turned into grasslands and grazing areas, or whether it should be preserved as forests. And if it is preserved as forests, how exactly would you help pay for the land? There's also a large amount of wood. Mahogany wood is from the Amazon area, and that's very valuable. The picture on the bottom left shows some informal logging of mahogany wood that goes on in the area, where people illegally log on a small scale to make extra money, sometimes to support their families. So here's a picture of deforestation on the right here, and there's often a distinct fishbone pattern where one existing road that has been clear cut will lead to other people cutting away from that road in a perpendicular manner, and then from that road other areas are cut, and it has kind of this odd fishbone pattern that you see on the bottom right picture compared to the top right picture. And to the left is an area of what was formerly rainforests, and now it's kind of open pasture land for cattle. And of course, cattle is often more profitable than just preserving wetlands as forests. Ecotourism is one thing that can be productive and can generate money from forests, but very often cattle is simply more profitable and desirable. So logging is also a threat not just in rainforests, but in also parts of Mexico as well. Mexico has an extensive subtropical forest called the Sierra Madre Range, and this is an area that, like parts of Brazil, has been clear cut for commercial logging. It's been converted into agriculture, and overgrazing threatens the area. And this area actually has one of the largest canyons in the world called the Copper Canyon. The Copper Canyon is actually larger than the Grand Canyon, and you can see it on the bottom right and left. And some people in the area are trying to promote the Copper Canyon as a tourist destination for backpackers and eco-travelers as a way of supporting conservation efforts in the area. In addition to having forests that have been clear-cut, rivers have also struggled with pollution in Latin America. These are some pictures of some polluted rivers in the area. Many rivers in South America are polluted, especially the Amazon and rivers that lead into the Amazon. Oil sometimes spills from pipelines into the water. Natural gas also can leak into the water. And there's also a significant amount of informal mining that goes on. Mercury is a very dangerous liquid metal that is used in informal gold mining. People will sift sand from the river basin and then use mercury to separate gold from other parts of sand and sediment in the river. And of course, this can leak into the water and become very toxic and poisonous, and it's dangerous to the people who handle the mercury as well. So mercury is a neurotoxin, and there are about 10 to 15 million small-scale gold miners in the Amazon area, and they probably produce about 15% of the world's gold, informal gold mining in the Amazon area. So it's bad for the people who do it, and it's bad for the drinking water, but people out of desperation sometimes will do it. So Latin America does have some successful conservation efforts and some national parks that have been set aside as nature preserves, some of which are successful tourist attractions and can generate revenue. The picture is the Iganaquo National Park, which is on the border of Argentina and Brazil. It was created in 1934 and is over 212 square miles. The oldest national park in the world is Yellowstone National Park, which was created in the 1870s. and it actually served as an example as to how land can be set aside for future generations and used to attract tourists. So Caracara National Park in Costa Rica is another famous national park in the region that was established in 1978. The picture of the parrot on the bottom right is in Caracara National Park, and it is a tropical rainforest set aside to protect biodiversity. Costa Rica has had a great deal of success with ecotourism, and it has achieved a goal of getting 99% of its energy from renewable sources as of 2017. So you are able, at least Costa Rica was able to produce 99% of its energy from wind, solar, hydroelectric power, and thermal power. And now other countries in the area are looking to Costa Rica as perhaps an example of how they can develop. And Belize is also trying to increase its status as an ecotourist destination as well. So setting land aside and protecting the environment can be a sound long-term economic policy for different countries. So I mentioned earlier that rainforests are incredibly diverse, and they have a significant amount of different plants and animals. About half the world's known animals live in the rainforests. That includes insects, and they attract a wide variety of animals and plants because they're a very complex ecosystem. The picture on the bottom right shows the different layers of the rainforest that they typically have. Usually the forest floor is not as thick as the canopy above, and relatively little light gets to it, which is why it's not as dense, and it doesn't often support as much life as other kinds of forests. Then as you get a little further up, there's an area underneath the canopy, and then there's the canopy layer, and there's the emergent layer. And the canopy layer and the emergent layer is where most of the plants and animals in the rainforest live. Orangutans are the largest tree-dwelling animal in the world. They're in Borneo and they're in Southeast Asia. They're not in South America, but they are an example of some of the life, monkeys and lemurs and birds and insects and snakes and so on, that can live in the forest canopy of these very dense rainforests. Some scientists think in addition to the complex multi-layered canopies that support life, rainforests also support large amounts of life because they've never suffered from mass extinctions the way that certain areas to the north and south have due to glaciers. In Michigan, about 12,000 years ago, almost all of what is now Michigan was covered by thick glaciers, sometimes a mile deep. The Great Lakes are only about 10,000 years old. They were created when the glaciers retreated after the last glacier retreated from North America. And when you have these massive glaciers move in, it's almost like a reset button. It kind of moves over and flattens and kills everything, and then it retreats. But these rainforests near the equator have never had mass extinctions caused by ice ages and so on. So because of that, they've matured over a longer period of time. And some scientists think that that partly explains why there's so much economic and biological diversity in rainforests compared to other biomes. So in addition to putting land aside as nature preserves and gold mining and cattle ranching, there has been some profit and some money from rainforests and elsewhere in Latin America from coca or cocaine production. The coca leaf, COCA, not to be confused with the cacao leaf, which is where chocolate comes from. But the coca leaf is grown in much of Latin America, Peru, Colombia, and elsewhere, and it is where cocaine comes from, cocaine and crack cocaine. And the leaf itself, if you tear it off and chew it, is a mild stimulant, somewhat like drinking coffee. But if you get large amounts of it and you process it into very highly refined cocaine, then it becomes highly addictive and also very profitable in different parts of the world. The eastern Andes have an elevation of about 6,000 to 11,000 feet, and that area, called cloud forests, are biologically diverse but also ideal conditions for growing coca leaves. Peru and Colombia have worked with the U.S. government to try to eradicate or reduce coca production with only some success. Basically, the profit margins are so high, if the demand is there, then there's almost certainly going to be some supply. 150 tons of cocaine were flown out of Peru in 2013, it is thought, and different government operations to try to reduce cocaine refinement and trafficking has only been partially successful. So we've mentioned earlier that these are areas that are dealing with rapid industrialization, some very large major cities, and that has caused problems with pollution, air pollution and water pollution and so on. And different cities have taken different steps to try to improve the quality of life in their cities and elsewhere. Bogota has a mass transit system called Transmilenio, which is in many ways one of the most successful mass transit systems in the world. It has a series of high-speed buses called Bus Rapid Transit that we mentioned a little bit about earlier that move large numbers of people, millions of people on a daily basis around the city. They have these long red articulated buses, or an articulated bus is one that has a bend in the middle, sometimes called accordion buses. And they have dedicated lanes that are only for these buses. Therefore, they're not clogged down in the same traffic congestion that other people have to deal with. And having dedicated lanes and frequent buses and large buses and level boarding makes the buses more desirable, and more people use them, and that pulls more cars off the road. So Bogota and other Latin American countries, and Mexico City has BRT lines, and many others have come up with new innovative ways to move people more efficiently. And typically BRT lines are about 1/3 the cost to build per mile as light rail, and typically about 1/10 the cost to build per mile compared to subway. So they are cheaper sometimes than alternatives. Santiago, Chile, and Mexico City are known to have very poor air quality. They are built in a basin surrounded by mountains, because hundreds of years ago when they were founded, that was a very good location to be. You had a relatively mild climate surrounded by mountains, so you were protected from perhaps marauding armies. Many of them had snow melt to supply water. And now, however, this advantage is a disadvantage, because these large cities in these bowls surrounded by mountains often trap pollution. Areas where there's more airflow that aren't protected by mountains has pollution drift away. But cities that are built in basins of mountains, Denver to some degree is like this as well, often when the weather conditions are right can have polluted air trapped within the city, and that can cause dangerous levels of pollution, especially during the winter. So this is an example of Bogota's Transmilenio mass transit system. It looks very much like a subway map, except these are BRT routes, high capacity, high-speed buses, typically with dedicated lanes that mimic subways or light rail lines. Latin America has some mega cities. A mega city is an area, a metropolitan area with 10 million people or more. Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, and recently Bogota, Colombia would be considered mega cities. Bogota's population just got above 10 million. And Rio de Janeiro hosted the Olympics in 2016, and they also hosted the World Cup in 2014. And it shows how rapidly some of these cities have grown, that they have grown significantly in the past 50 years or so as people from rural areas have moved into urban areas. So now South America has about 80% of the population living in urban areas, and it was much lower previously. And some of these big cities in Latin America have very poor air quality, even worse than many cities in the U.S. Air pollution in Mexico City is very bad. Between 1950 and 1980, Mexico City had an annual growth rate of 4.8%, meaning the metropolitan area grew 4.8% on average each year for all those years. So it's a rapidly growing city, and the area is in a valley about 7,400 feet above sea level. And because of the surrounding mountains, it has a tendency, especially in the winter, to trap some of the bad air, and it doesn't circulate, and it can stay above the city in dangerously high levels for some time. High pollution can cause higher death rates due to heart disease, asthma, influenza, pneumonia, and other health-related problems. Detroit and Chicago, for example, although they're fairly industrial, Detroit and Chicago are flat cities. You have a consistent wind blowing from the west towards the east that tends to blow pollution away. Although they're both still industrial, they're nowhere nearly as industrial as they were previously. So air pollution in, say, Santiago, Chile, or New Mexico would be significantly worse than it would be even in industrial Midwestern cities. Uh, where we now have Mexico City actually is not an incredibly old city. The Aztecs founded the city of what was Tenochtitlan and what is now Mexico City in the 1200s. Basically, Aztecs from further north of Mexico were kind of moving down south looking for a place to settle. A small group of Aztecs where they found this large valley and then they settled there. And then the city from the 1200s rapidly grew. And when the Spanish conquistador discovered it in the early 1500s, he was surprised by how large it was. This was a city of probably about 200,000 people, significantly larger than London would have been at the time, probably around the same size as Paris, and maybe one of the top 5 largest cities in the world in the early 1500s. So Cortez found this massive city that the Aztecs had founded in what is now Mexico City. And then he saw some of the ritual sacrifices that they did to their enemies. The Aztecs would bring people to the top of pyramids, cut their hearts out while they were still alive, and then throw their bodies down the pyramids. And they would do this to thousands of people in a given year. And the Spanish thought that this was satanic. So they sided with a lot of other local Native American tribes against the Aztecs and were able to capture the emperor and eventually overthrow the Aztec government. And then they tore down many of the temples the Aztecs had and then eventually rebuilt some churches on where they had previously had Aztec temples. So this is an example of a very large city in the Americas at the time the Europeans discovered it. Now Mexico City is also suffering from a lack of water because of not enough snow runoff. In addition to Mexico City, Bogota, Quito, La Paz, Bolivia are also having water shortages, partly caused by retreating glaciers and simply lower amount of snow melt. So many people in these Latin American cities have to purchase water and have them driven in on trucks, and then people just pump water out of a truck into barrels like we might do with swimming pools, and then that's where many people get their water supply from. Now, Latin America has a very interesting city in Brazil, the capital of Brazil, called Brasilia, and this is actually an example of a 20th century planned city. Some other cities in the region grew haphazardly, some of them are fairly old. Brasilia is a capital that was built in the late 1950s to be Brazil's new capital in the middle of the interior of the continent, in the interior of the country. And if you look at this city from the sky, it looks kind of like an airplane. The center part where you might have the fuselage of the plane is the city center. There's a mall in the middle of it, similar to what we would have in DC with our mall. And it was possibly inspired by DC. And then as you go away from that center part, there are large blocks of mixed-use buildings about 6 stories tall. And this city was originally designed to be a city of about 600,000 people. And now the metropolitan area is about 3 million people. And it's the 4th largest metro area in the country. It also has a lot of very interesting and unique architecture. Again, it was planned in the late 1950s, founded in 1960. Now it has about 2.6 million people, and one of its planners was an architect named Oscar Niemeyer and also Lucio Costa. And in addition to planning the cities and the layout of the city, they planned many of the buildings in what might be called mid-century modern architectural style. And Oscar Niemeyer actually lived to be 104 years old. He passed away just recently. So the building on the top is the Brazilian Parliament, and the bottom one is the Brazilian Supreme Court. So if you like mid-century modern architecture, Brasilia has a lot of very fascinating architectural buildings. Here are some other buildings that Oscar Niemeyer designed. Oscar Niemeyer Museum, the Cathedral of Brasilia, and the Museum of Contemporary Art, all designed by this architect. This is an interior shot of the cathedral in Brazil, the National Cathedral. In addition to Brasilia, other major cities in Brazil include Curitiba. This is a city of about 2 million people, and it's actually known for its green planning in sharp contrast to Mexico City or Santiago, Chile, or La Paz, which sometimes suffer from pollution. This is a city that has made it a priority to have large amounts of green space, good mass transit, encouraging public transportation, recycling, and so on, and it's considered one of the greenest cities in Latin America. On the bottom, you see a large articulated bus in a bus rapid transit system, meaning that the buses run on dedicated lanes separate from general traffic, so they're faster and more reliable. People pay before they get on the bus, so you can load on the bus and get off the bus faster, and it's been a very efficient and relatively inexpensive form of mass transit for the city. This is an idea of bus rapid transit that has spread to a lot of other cities, including some in North America. On this slide, the picture on the top is the Cleveland Health Line, one of the most advanced BRT systems in North America. The green bus is the Grand Rapids Silver Line, and on the bottom left is the Las Vegas Max Line, and the bottom right is Eugene, Oregon. So this is something that cities in the U.S. have adopted to some extent as well. Gondolas are another practical form of transportation that some cities in Latin America and others have adopted to try to alleviate traffic congestion from rapidly growing cities. Gondolas are used often in ski resorts here in the U.S. and elsewhere, but they can be a very practical form of transit, especially when you're on uneven terrain and mountains where roads would require a lot of switchbacks and where you don't have a lot of straight roads, where it makes a lot of sense to glide above some of the congestion below. They're relatively cheap, and the one on the top is a cable car in La Paz, Bolivia, and the picture on the bottom is a cable car near Rio de Janeiro. La Paz, Rio de Janeiro, and Medellin all have gondolas, Medellin in Colombia. And in New York, they have a gondola that links Manhattan to Roosevelt Island. Roosevelt Island is an island just off of Manhattan in the Hudson River, and they have these large red gondolas that can move about 40 to 50 people at once that link this island to the main part of Manhattan. And Portland, Oregon also has recently adopted gondolas, or aerial trams as they're sometimes called, to move people around parts of their city as well. Now, Latin America has about 3/4 of the population living in cities. It also has something that's called urban primacy, and urban primacy is when you have one large dominant city in a country that is the cultural, economic, and financial head of that country. We don't have as many examples of that in North America. Very often in many states, the biggest city isn't even the capital. The capital of Michigan, of course, is Lansing, but Detroit's the largest city. In New York State, New York City is far and away the largest, but Albany is the capital. So in many parts of the world, though, you'll often have a large capital city that's far and away the largest city, and it is the cultural, economic, and political center of that country. Mexico City is a good example of urban primacy in Latin America, same with Santiago, Chile. And as you can see here, the picture shows the density, population density of Latin America, and certain parts of it are denser than others. Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo are in the center of a very large, dense area in Brazil. But then you get into the interior and the Amazon, it's very lightly populated, except for the large city of Manaus, which is in the center of the Amazon. And then in Mexico, there's Mexico City, which is very dense, and then Guatemala City and parts of El Salvador are dense, and then other parts along the Andes and the Amazon are significantly less dense. So the population and settlement of Latin America shows a pattern of dominant cities. This is a chart that shows the population in millions, population per square kilometer, natural rate of increase, fertility rate, and other demographic information. And this is a region that has quite a bit of variation when it comes to, say, the total fertility rate. It's relatively low in, say, Costa Rica and Chile, and then it's significantly higher in, say, Bolivia and Nicaragua and elsewhere. So what the average number of children that women in countries have varies significantly in the region. The percentage of those below 15 also varies significantly. It can be relatively high, such as in Guatemala, or relatively low in other countries. And also the percent above 65 varies significantly. So Argentina is relatively old and well off, and Costa Rica is the same. And then El Salvador and Guatemala and some Central American countries have a younger population, a more rapidly growing population. As you can see, the largest country in the region by population is Brazil, followed by Mexico. Latin America has development patterns that are somewhat similar. Very often there's an old colonial core and an area that was founded sometimes centuries ago, often by the Spanish or the Portuguese. And then along that core, there's often a mall or a major commercial center relatively close to that old center core. And then linking the old city center and the shopping area is often a relatively affluent area of high-end houses. And then you sometimes have middle-class homes around it. And then on the outside of many major cities, you often have slums and inexpensive makeshift housings. This is sometimes the reverse of what it is in the U.S. In the U.S., often intercity areas are poorer, and then the suburbs are more affluent, although that is starting to change as more people move into the city centers. But in Latin America, usually downtown, older parts of cities are older and more affluent, and as you get further away from the old historic core in the commercial area in the city center, you have more squatter settlements and more slums and poor quality of housing. These are some examples of slums or squatter settlements, sometimes known as favelas. Urban poor living in these areas often build on land they don't technically own with whatever materials they have available. Roads are typically unpaved. Water is often trucked in. Sometimes you can collect water from the rain. Most of the areas don't have running water, but most of these actually do have electricity, even though it might be sporadic. Some Latin American cities, as many as a third of the people might live in favelas. Rio de Janeiro is very well known for that. Mexico City to a lesser extent. The two people on the bottom are some activists from, I believe, Denmark that decided that they're going to paint a large portion of a favela in Brazil just to try to bring a little cheer and distinct culture to the area. So that's what they did. There's an interesting TED Talk about that. So the idea was they just wanted to kind of maybe make a part of the favela into a tourist attraction by making it painted in really bold, bright stripes that's very visible from far away. So Rio de Janeiro and other large cities in Brazil, before the run-up to hosting the 2014 World Cup and 2016 Olympics, wanted to do what they called pacifying of the slums. And there were large parts of Rio that were overrun with drugs and gangs. And then the police, along with the military, moved into many of these really rough neighborhoods, drove out some of the drug gangs, and tried to pacify these by making them safer and nicer places to live. This has been somewhat successful, but unfortunately what often happened is after an area was pacified, rents started to skyrocket because suddenly the area was more desirable, and many of the people who had previously lived there were driven out due to high rents. Also, sometimes squatters who were living in these neighborhoods that were pacified were also driven out along with some of the suspected drug dealers. So there was a lot of displacement of poor people in many neighborhoods in Rio and elsewhere when the police were pacifying them in the run-up to the 2014 World Cup and the Olympics. Many people in poor parts of the big cities in Rio and elsewhere have nowhere else to live other than squatter settlements because formal housing is often too expensive. So in this region, Latin America, about 125 million people are living in rural areas. Some of them are farmers. Some of them are small-scale subsistence farmers. There's often a very uneven distribution of land. A small number of wealthy people, often descendants of Europeans, control large tracts of land, while poor people often try to get by on smaller, less efficient subsistence farms. Uh, Latifundia is a phrase used to describe the large number of large farms that a relatively small number of people own. And minifundia is kind of the opposite. This is land that is set aside for the poor for subsistence farming. There have been some attempts at agrarian reform where there's some redistribution of land to try to give it to poor people, but this has been not nearly enough. And there's also been a push to kind of move into the frontier parts of the Amazon and Latin America and open them up to farming specifically for soybeans or possibly sugarcane, and also opening them up for cattle ranches as well. So there's been an official policy in some parts of Latin America to push into the frontiers and the wilderness to open it up to agriculture and cattle ranching. There's been a significant amount of movement in Latin America, a lot of people moving to Latin America, especially from Europe in the late 1800s, and then in the late 20th century, many people moving from Latin America to the United States and elsewhere. There was a large independence movement in Latin America in the early 1800s, where most of the countries in Latin America broke away from Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule. Latin American rulers encouraged immigrants after these revolutions. They encouraged immigrants from Europe to move to Latin America. They wanted to increase the number of Europeans living in the area. So from the 1870s to the 1930s, about 8 million Europeans arrived in Latin America, most of them settling in the southern countries of Argentina and Chile and Uruguay. In fact, if you look at the picture on the bottom left, that looks almost like a Bavarian village, but that's actually a small community in Chile. There's also a fair number of Asian immigrants that came over in the 1800s, many Japanese. Some of them worked on coffee plantations and in sugar plantations, and many of the Asian immigrants that came over are now working class professionals, including a large Japanese Brazilian population in Sao Paulo, Brazil. So European migration to the area peaked around the late 1800s, and then of course there was large Asian migration, and many Latinos that had moved out of Latin America to Canada or the United States have sent back remittances. This is basically people working outside the country, say Mexico or El Salvador. Say they're working in the United States, they'll work there, they'll send money back to friends and family back in Mexico or elsewhere, and this is actually a fairly important part of the economy. Guatemala and El Salvador had had a lot of people displaced from civil war and bad economies and crime, and they have sent back remittances. Latin America has received remittances equal to about $70 billion in 2008. That amount of money declined slightly during the Great Recession when there weren't as many jobs available. It's been estimated in 2011 it declined to about $61 billion, and it's gone up slightly since then. But remittances are a major part of the economy in Latin America. There was a large movement of people from, again, Spain and Portugal to Latin America. Those two countries are called the Iberian Peninsula. The geographic landmass that Spain and Portugal are on is called the Iberian Peninsula. And there's been a blending of European and American Indian cultures over the centuries. And this has also had some forced assimilation, where some Indian cultures have been encouraged or forced to integrate more with the European cultures that moved in, and some Indian cultures have remained separate and remained resilient, keeping to their old ways. Occasionally you'll hear about so-called undiscovered people in Brazil. A picture on the bottom right is a very remote tribe in the interior of the Amazon in Brazil. Most of these so-called undiscovered tribes have had ancestors that have previously come into contact with Europeans, and then they fled European contact because they were afraid of losing their land or getting European diseases. So many of these uncontacted people are aware of the outside world. They just choose not to be a part of it and have moved further into the interior of the Amazon. There was a massive decline in native populations in the Americas, North and South America, especially from about 1500 to 1650. The indigenous population shrank to an astonishingly low 1/10 of its pre-contact size, meaning about 90% of the population, or there's a shrinkage of 90% of the population in the Americas of native people after they came into contact with Europeans. Native Americans in South America and elsewhere had no immunity to European diseases. Smallpox was especially devastating. Influenza was also devastating. So the combination of European diseases, warfare, forced labor, and starvation over a century and a half decimated the Native American population. And the Native American population in the Americas was about 1/10 of what it was in 1650 as it was in 1500 before European contact. Spanish explorers did see very large populations in the Amazon when they first came into contact with populations there. Now the Amazon is fairly lightly populated, but an explorer named Francisco de Ortelas explored the Amazon in 1542. He was an associate of another conquistador called Pizarro, and he was with Pizarro, and he was asked to scout ahead on the Amazon to see if there was a good place that they could ferry across the river. Well, as he went down the river, he realized that the current was so strong he couldn't get back, and he became separated from the main unit. He became separated from Pizarro's troops. And then Francisco basically floated down the Amazon for several thousand miles because he couldn't get back upstream, and he noted large population settlements along the Amazon. There was very little stone in some of the cities. The cities were made from local materials. So when Europeans thought of large cities, we typically think of large stone cities like in Rome or in Greece. But there were large cities that were made out of local materials such as mud and grass. And in the 1540s, it seemed like there was a significantly larger native population in the Amazon than there probably would be even now. So the Spanish and Portuguese invaded what is now the Americas and enslaved many of the American Indian populations. Many of the Native Americans died of European diseases or escaped into the wilderness. Natives were supposed to be converted into Christians and then used for labor and forced to work on difficult, backbreaking work on plantations such as sugarcane plantations, and also many Native Americans were forced to work in different silver mines and gold mines as well. What often happened is Europeans would come into contact with the native population. The native population would rapidly be decimated because they would either flee or they would die of different European diseases. And then often Europeans would bring in Africans to do the work that had previously been done by Native Americans. And that's something that's very common in the Caribbean and in parts of Brazil too, that pattern of Europeans coming and enslaving natives, Native Americans escaping or dying of disease, and then that population being replaced with people from Africa forced into slavery. So the decline of the native population was significant, but there are certain parts of Latin America where American Indians have managed to survive and adapt to modern times. The Guyan Yala is a Native American group in Panama that maintained a territory in the country of Panama since the 1920s. They have a large, what you might consider, Native American reservation along a large part of the coast of Panama. And they live in San Blas Islands and the northeast coast of Panama. And they've actually tried to hang on to much of their culture and try to actually attract tourists to their part of the country. Here's a picture of the Yuna Yala and their culture. 1/10 of Panama is American Indian, and this is a group that governs itself, and it has preserved a large portion of the rainforest and has held off the desire to turn it into cattle ranches or elsewhere, and has done a pretty good job promoting ecotourism and kind of hanging on to as much of their native culture as they can. So patterns of settlement in the area often included Europeans coming in and bringing Catholicism with them, and Portuguese and the Spanish were overwhelmingly Catholic in the 1500s, as they are now. And some of these Catholic traditions intermingled with indigenous traditions and languages to create sort of a blurring of Catholicism along with native religions. There also were some very beautiful and fabulous Catholic churches that were built in Latin America, many of which are still standing. The picture here is a picture in, I believe, Bogota, Colombia, of a Catholic church there. And in this slide, the top left is a Spanish colonial Iglesia del Calabrio, that is in Nicaragua. Top right is Cathedral of Lima, Peru. Bottom left is a cathedral in Ecuador. And on the bottom right is Cathedral Basilica de Salta in Argentina. So as you can see, some of these beautiful large churches go back to the 1700s. Some of them are even older than that. So lots of great architecture in Latin America. So patterns of ethnicity in the area. There are many different languages. The two biggest languages in the region, though, are Spanish and Portuguese. About 2/3 of Latin America speaks Spanish. About 1/3 speaks Portuguese in Brazil. And these are other smaller indigenous languages that are in the area as well, too. Many of these are just languages that natives still speak. Bolivia is known for having a large American Indian population where some people don't even speak Spanish. My parents actually went to Bolivia on vacation about 8 years ago, and the people that they met there spoke their native languages, and they spoke English, and they didn't even speak Spanish. They detested the Spanish so much for the brutal history of colonialism that they refused to even learn Spanish, and they just spoke their native language plus English, and they never bothered to learn Spanish because they didn't want to succumb to Spanish influence. So especially in the Andes, there are lots of other languages spoken besides Spanish and Portuguese. So Latin culture has had a significant influence on other cultures around the world, and it's also been significantly influenced by other cultures, especially European cultures. Univision is a very common network in Latin America. It's basically kind of like NBC or ABC in Latin America. Soccer is very common, very popular sport, especially in Mexico and Brazil. And telenovelas are incredibly popular. These goofy, soapy shows that we have in the U.S., but they're even more popular in Latin America, and men watch them too without shame. Some people have speculated that telenovelas are so popular it might actually be driving down the birth rate. They often have strong, powerful, wealthy, educated women who usually have relatively small families, and some psychologists and sociologists think that might have encouraged women to hold off on getting married, to get an education, and have smaller families themselves, because that's what everyone on TV tends to do. I saw a video of a taxi driver in Brazil watching a telenovela while he was driving some of his customers around. It's just very popular there. So the political framework and redrawing the map of Latin America. Latin America was divided between the Portuguese and the Spanish by the Treaty of Tordesillas, and in the late 1400s, the Pope at the time drew a line of demarcation along Latin America, roughly between the western tip of Europe and the Bahamas, where Columbus discovered. And this line basically gave everything that was east of this line to the Portuguese and everything that was west to the Spanish. So you can see here a map of Latin America in 1650 on the right. Brazil was in purple. Areas dominated by Spain were in green. And then Viceroy of Peru was basically a Spanish, a kingdom that was indirectly controlled by Spain. And then by the 1830s, we have some of the modern countries we know: Peru, Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Chile starting to form. And of course, in the 1830s, much of what is now the Southwest was part of Mexico. The U.S. went to war with Mexico in the 1840s and won, and Mexico lost a very large portion of its territory during that war, the Mexican-American War. And this is the Pope that helped negotiate the dividing line between the Portuguese and the Spanish. Pope Alexander VI divided the world between the Spanish and Portugal. The line of demarcation was 370 leagues or 1,276 miles west of Cape Verde. Cape Verde are a series of islands off the coast of Africa. That was kind of the furthest western part of the known world at that time. And this dividing line was about halfway between Cape Verde and the islands in the Bahamas that Columbus discovered. So what is now modern-day Brazil, one of the first people to discover it was a captain named Pedro Cabral, and he discovered Brazil in 1500. He was sailing to India a little bit roughly along this line of demarcation, and while he was sailing to India, his fleet of 15 ships discovered what is now Brazil, roughly near the city of Rio de Janeiro. And so he sailed from Lisbon, Portugal, then landed in Brazil, then from there sailed to Africa to refuel, and then from there sailed to India. So on this one journey, he landed in 4 separate continents, and it's believed he and his fleet was the first group of people to ever sail to 4 continents on one journey. And in Latin America in the early 1800s, there was a large revolutionary movement where different local countries, like in the U.S., partly inspired by the U.S. a generation before, wanted to break away from Spanish and Portuguese rule. So Spain controlled much of South America until 1810. Then revolutionary movements expelled the Spanish by 1826, and Brazil slowly became independent from Portugal by 1884. Venezuela specifically declared independence in 1811. Simon Bolivar liberated most of the northern part of South America in that time. And then in 1816, Jose Francisco de San Martin liberated South America from Spanish rule, and he's considered a hero in Peru and Argentina. So these two people are kind of considered the George Washingtons of Latin America in the early 1800s. So now the region is organized by some supranational organizations. Supranational organization is an organization made up of multiple countries, or a trade bloc is an example. NAFTA is an example of supranational organization. UNASAR, UNASAR, or Union of South American Nations, is also an example of that. And that's an organization that is designed to promote trade within Latin America, try to resolve disputes, legal disputes, and so on in Latin America, and try to represent the region on a global scale to promote the region. There are also subnational organizations, and these are organizations that operate within different countries, and they could be criminal organizations, or they could be terrorist organizations, or other organizations. ISIS might be an example of a subnational organization operating in the Middle East. This is a map of the influence of different crime syndicates in Mexico. This is Mexican cartels as of 2011. Some of them shift from time to time, but we know with a fair degree of certainty which cartels control different parts of the country. And Mexico has battled very violent drug cartels for several years now, and tens of thousands of people have died in drug-related violence. Whereas Mexico, right on the border with El Paso, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, is a very dangerous city with a very high crime rate, similar to some cities in war zones. And then right across the border, El Paso, Texas, is one of the safest cities of its size in the United States. So this is an example of the intra-national organizations, drug cartels that have significant influence over Mexico. So at the end of the Cold War, many Latin American countries decided that they wanted to adopt more free trade, encourage foreign investment, adopt an economic policy similar to what the U.S. and Canada were proposing, sometimes called neoliberal policies. And Latin America was dominated by neoliberal policies in the 1990s and still generally is. One of the big exceptions would be Venezuela. Venezuela has been the exact opposite of that. They have had different leaders that have nationalized a lot of foreign assets such as oil, and their economies have actually suffered significantly because of it. But most countries are encourage foreign investment, export production, and privatization. And different organizations that have promoted these neoliberal economic policies includes CAFTA, Central American Free Trade Agreement, Mercosur, and NAFTA, which encourages interregional cooperation and free trade and lower tariffs. So this is economic and social development information on Latin America, focusing on neoliberalism. And it basically shows the GNI per capita. This is essentially the wealth of a country adjusted for the cost of living. The higher the better. Venezuela, Mexico, and Costa Rica are fairly high, although this information is a little old. Venezuela's economy has has taken a nosedive in the last 3 years. GDP, average annual growth, again, the higher the better. Human Development Index, again, the higher the better. Chile is relatively well off at 0.8, and Nicaragua relatively low at 0.5. And then the percent of population living below poverty, life expectancy, and other demographic information. Argentina and Costa Rica are usually towards the top of most of these indexes, and El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras are generally towards the bottom of these. So there's a significant amount of variation between the countries. So different countries have had different development strategies. Some countries have been able to rely on natural resources. Brazil has a lot of land, 5th largest amount of land out of any country in the world. After the U.S. were number 3, and then Brazil is number 5. Australia is 4. A lot of soybean production, oil production, natural gas production. The cost and value of natural gas and oil has declined somewhat in the last 4 years. That has hurt the Brazilian economy. Other countries like Mexico have invested heavily in the large amount of cheap labor that they have. There are lots of factories in Mexico, many of them along the U.S.-Mexican border, called maquiladores. And these are large factories, usually along the U.S. border, with large numbers of often female workers. And they've been an important part of the Mexican economy. They've been controversial because many of the jobs and factories that we hear have gone down to Mexico have moved down to Mexico, often right on the other side of the U.S. border. So they have, the plus side is they have presumably driven down costs by making things that can be made with less money. The consumers might save money, but it also means that you can lose industrial jobs as well. So a very varied economy. Most countries in Latin America make money with a combination of manufacturing and natural resources, and in Costa Rica, ecotourism is big. And many of the economies have fared fairly well, but when you're too dependent on one thing, such as oil or natural gas, and the value of that commodity drops, then it can cause major problems for the economy, which is what Brazil's gone through in the last 3 to 4 years as natural gas and oil has declined. So Latin America, as it is part of the global economy, it has been dependent historically. Some intellectuals in Latin America think that they have been too dependent on European economies, and they needed to become more independent and more diversified. So some Latin American countries, such as Brazil, have encouraged a lot of foreign investment. China has invested a significant amount of money in Brazil, especially in agriculture. And as I mentioned, there's a push for neoliberalism, encouraging foreign investment, bringing down barriers to trade, bringing down tariffs, trying to privatize as much of the economy as possible. And there's also been a trend towards dollarization. Dollarization is when a country either flat out adopts the dollar as their currency, such as Panama and Ecuador and El Salvador. They literally use the US dollar as their currency, or they have their own currency, but they try to peg it at the dollar. And they try to adopt currency that they have themselves that more or less mimics the value of the dollar. Canada and Australia have currency that's often similar to what the US dollar is worth. But Panama, Ecuador, and El Salvador just decided, rather than deal with currency that goes up and down all the time, why not just use the dollar as our currency? It's stable, it's dependable, it will encourage foreign investment, and that is what they've done. So that's called dollarization, when different countries adopt the US dollar as their currency or have their own currency that's similar to the dollar. Latin America, in the global economy, as mentioned earlier, a lot of the money in many countries comes from remittances. And you can see in the top right, it shows that countries that are greener receive a large amount of money in remittances, and lighter countries not as much. And then there's also a significant amount of foreign investment in different countries. So the bars represent foreign investment, and the green of the countries themselves represent the amount of remittances they have. So Honduras has had a significant amount of foreign investment. El Salvador has as well. Paraguay, as you can see, Argentina, not as much. And then remittances are a major part of the economy in El Salvador, Mexico, Guatemala, and Ecuador and Bolivia, and a significantly smaller amount in Brazil, Argentina, and elsewhere. So in order to encourage people to stay in school and try to promote upward mobility, some countries in Latin America, specifically Brazil, have adopted policies where they essentially will pay parents to keep their kids, specifically daughters, in schools and make sure that they get vaccinated, make sure that they're seeing a doctor for fitnesses on a regular basis. And they've tried to promote education and proper health as a type of upward mobility. This is sometimes called Bolsa Familia, basically bolstering the family. And this has been somewhat successful. The birth rates in Latin America have gone down significantly. The level of education, specifically with women, has gone up significantly. So some of these programs, similar to what we have with Medicare and Social Security in our country, have been quite successful. Many parts of Latin America, especially Brazil, have a large African population, although in Latin America there are many people of mixed race, people who are descendants who are part African, part European, part American Indian. And some countries have a tendency to have few minorities in positions of power. Brazil is famous for this. The country probably has 40 to 45% of its population that are have some African ancestry, but relatively few members of parliament that are black or of African ancestry. The status of women in Latin America, as far as a number in parliament, is probably about the same or even slightly better than it is in the U.S. Brazil had a female president. She is no longer in power, but she was elected a few years ago. So it's an area that is very racially mixed, some significant problems with income inequality and race inequality, but also some bright spots when it comes to women serving in public office. This is a picture of some children in Panama going to school. So I mentioned earlier that there are many mixed race persons in Latin America, and in the U.S. Census we typically have white, African American, Latino, Native American, and Asian. But in Latin America, they have somewhat of a different idea. They have what you might call, I don't know, perhaps boutique races. They have a large number of very specific races. This is kind of a tradition that was inherited from the Spanish. For instance, if one parent is Spanish and one parent is Indian, you could be mestizo. If one parent is black and another is Spanish, you might be mulatto. And as you can see here, they have these rather elaborate charts where they try to give very, very specific, relatively small races based on whether your parents were Spanish, Indian, black, a mix of both. It's kind of crazy. While in the U.S. we would simply say mixed race, in Latin America sometimes they get almost comically specific about what race certain would be. Okay, so number 13, if you're a Barcino and mulatto, your child will be a coyote. If you're number 10, Zambaggio, and your parent was Indian, then you'd be a Kumbojo. I mean, it's quite elaborate. So this odd obsession with classifying races incredibly specifically is kind of an old Spanish tradition that the Spanish brought over from Europe. Here's another picture of various races in real intricate detail, depending on what your parents were. So we talked about Social Development Index. This is a picture of the former president of Brazil, the first female president they had. Percent of seats held by women in national parliaments, as you can see, it varies significantly. Brazil and Colombia, relatively few women. Venezuela and Bolivia, about 10 to 20%. In light green, 21 to 30%. The U.S. would be roughly 20 to 23% female in U.S. Congress and state Congress in Michigan. And then in Argentina, relatively high, more than 40% of the women in their country's parliament, more than 40% of the population in their country's parliament are women. So the status of women as far as their positions in power and authority varies significantly. Argentina, Peru, Mexico are fairly progressive. Colombia and Brazil, not as much. So let's have a couple quick review questions. The most populous country in Latin America is? And the answer is Brazil, the 5th largest country in the world, both land-wise and population-wise. Which climate type is not found in Latin America? So of these different climate types, what would you not see in Latin America? And the answer is continental mid-latitude climates. So what we have in Michigan, cold winters and warm summers, are simply not found in Latin America. They have lots of different varieties of climate, but the continental climate that we're used to is not in Latin America. Primate cities are considered problematic because we talked a little bit about primate cities. We didn't really talk about the downside, but one of the downsides of a primate city, meaning a city that's far and away the largest, most powerful economically, politically, culturally, and a downside is too many national resources are concentrated in that one urban area. This can be a problem with Mexico City, with Santiago, Chile. London, England would be an example of that in Europe. In the United States is simply not as common. It's very common for U.S. states to have a capital that is not the largest city. In fact, it's rare to find an example of urban primacy in the U.S. One example might be Phoenix. Phoenix is far and away the largest city in Arizona and the capital of Arizona. Another might be Indianapolis, which is far and away the biggest city in Indiana and also the capital. But usually in the U.S., you have a more dispersed as far as what's the capital, what's the largest city, and so on. Large estates owned by absentee landlords are known as latifundia. Minifundia is the opposite. That's land that's been set aside for relatively small subsistence farmers. In Brazil, which ethnic group is associated with the expansion of soybean and orange production? We mentioned this briefly. Large numbers of Japanese came over to Brazil and worked in soybean, worked in coffee plantations and elsewhere. And now many Asian Brazilians are middle-class persons and fairly well educated. At the time of arrival, the indigenous population was estimated at 54 million people. 100 to about 150 years later, the indigenous population had been reduced by 90%. Again, disease and war and famine, but especially disease, decimated native populations after they came into contact with Europeans. They had no immunity to European diseases. Smallpox was devastating. Influenza was devastating. Interestingly enough, about the only disease that is known to have transferred from American Indians to Europeans is syphilis. That was a disease that was common but not particularly serious among Native Americans, and Europeans had no immunity to it. And when Europeans got that, it's a sexually transmitted disease, they often died for a while until they were able to build up an immunity to it. So it's a rare example of a disease traveling from the Americas over to European populations. In terms of economic development, which of the following countries is among the poorest? And that would be Bolivia. Argentina, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Uruguay are economically better off than Bolivia. Bolivia has relatively few natural resources compared to other countries. It's landlocked, one of the few Latin American countries that's landlocked, so it's relatively poor compared to some of their neighbors. Based on the map, which of the following statements is correct? Talking about demographics and population density. And B, Latin Americans are concentrated in cities. As you can see here, there are lots of parts of Latin America that are very sparsely populated. The Andes Mountains, the Amazon Basin, Patagonia, the bottom quarter roughly of South America. So Latin Americans are concentrated in cities. About 75 to maybe 78% live in cities. If you have any questions, please email me at wrenando@jccmi.edu. And if you would like to set up a video conference, you can, of course, do that as well. I've enjoyed a lot of the different articles that people have been forwarding to me as part of their assignments. It's been very interesting reading those. So I think you're all doing very well. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.